stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about Mrs. Harlowe. A widow lives in Dijon with her niece Betty and Betty's paid companion Ann Upcott. When Mrs. Harlowe dies, her English solicitors receive a blackmailing letter from her brother-in-law Boris Waberski. He accuses Betty of poisoning Mrs. Harlowe, and junior partner Jim Frobisher is dispatched to Dijon to provide legal advice. The local authorities call in Inspector Hanaud, who is convinced that a murder did take place. Jim Frobisher is certain that Betty is innocent, but if she didn't do it, who did? Did Ann Upton do it to get hands on a priceless pearl necklace? Did Boris Waberski himself manage to do the deed? Inspector Hanaud may use unusual and mystifying methods, but he'll triumph in the end with a spectacular grand finale. "There," he said. "Now, mademoiselle, you are comfortable. For me, if I am permitted, I shall smoke." He turned round to ask for permission of Betty, who with Jim had followed into the garden behind him. "Of course," she answered, and coming forward, she sat down in another of the chairs. Hanaud pulled out of a pocket a bright blue bundle of thin black cigarettes and lit one. Then he sat in a chair close to the two girls. Jim Frobisher stood behind Hanaud. The lawn was dappled with sunlight and cool shadows. The blackbird and the thrush were calling from bough and bush, the garden was riotous with roses and the air sweet with their perfume. It was a strange setting for the eerie story which Ann Upcott had to tell of her adventures in the darkness and silence of a night, but the very contrast seemed to make the story still more vivid. "I did not go to Monsieur de Poulac's ball on the night of April the 27th, she began, and Jim started, so that Hanaud raised his hand to prevent him interrupting. He had not given a thought to where Ann Upcott had been upon that night. To Hanaud, however, the statement brought no surprise. "You were not well?" he asked. "It wasn't that," Anne replied. "But Betty and I had, I won't say a rule, but a sort of working arrangement which I think had been in practice ever since I came to the Maison Grenelle. We didn't encroach upon each other's independence." The two girls had recognized from their first coming together that privacy was the very salt of companionship. Each had a sanctuary in her own sitting room. "I don't think Betty has ever been in mine, I only once or twice in hers," said Anne. "We had each our own friends. We didn't pester each other with questions as to where we had been and with whom. In a word, we weren't all the time shadows upon each other's heels." "A wise rule, mademoiselle," Hanaud agreed cordially. "A good many households are split from roof to cellar by the absence of just such a rule." "The de Poulacs then were Mademoiselle Betty's friends?" "Yes. As soon as Betty had gone," Anne resumed, "I told Gaston that he might turn off the lights and go to bed whenever he liked, and I went upstairs to my own sitting room, which is next to my bedroom. You can see the windows from here. There." They were in a group facing the back of the only house across the garden. To the right of the hall stretched the line of shuttered windows, with Betty's bedroom just above. Anne pointed to the wing on the left of the hall and towards the road. "I see. You are above the library, mademoiselle," said Hanaud. "Yes. I had a letter to write," Anne continued, and suddenly faltered. She had come upon some obstacle in the telling of her story which she had forgotten when she had uttered her cry in the library. She gasped. "Oh," she murmured, and again "oh," in a low voice. She glanced anxiously at Betty, but she got no help from her at all. Betty was leaning forward with her elbows upon her knees and her eyes on the grass at her feet and apparently miles away in thought. "Yes, mademoiselle," Hanaud asked smoothly. "It was an important letter," Anne went on again, choosing her words warily, much as yesterday at one moment in her interrogatory Betty herself had done concealing something, too, just as Betty had done. "I had promised faithfully to write it. But the address was downstairs in Betty's room. It was the address of a doctor, and having said that, it seemed that she had cleared her obstacle, for she went on in a more easy and natural tone. "You know what it is, Monsieur Hanaud. I had been playing tennis all the afternoon. I was pleasantly tired. There was a letter to be written with a good deal of care, and the address was all the way downstairs. I said to myself that I would think out the terms of my letter first. And here Jim Frobisher, who had been shifting impatiently from one foot to the other, broke in upon the narrative. "But what was this letter about, and to what doctor?" he asked. Hanaud swung round almost angrily. "Oh, please," he cried. "These things will all come to light of themselves in their due order, if we leave them alone and keep them in our memories. Let Mademoiselle tell her story in her own way," and he was back at Ann Upcott again in a flash. "Yes, Mademoiselle. You determined to think out the tenor of your letter." A hint of a smile glimmered upon the girl's face for a second. "But it was an excuse, really, an excuse to sit down in my big armchair, stretch out my legs and do nothing at all. You can guess what happened." Hanaud smiled and nodded. "You fell fast asleep. Conscience does not keep young people, who are healthy and tired, awake," he said. "No, but it wakes up with them," Anne returned, and upbraids at once bitterly. "I woke up rather chilly, as people do who have gone to sleep in their chairs. I was wearing a little thin frock of pale blue tulle, oh, a featherweight of a frock. Yes, I was cold and my conscience was saying, 'Oh, big lazy one.' And your letter? Where is it?" In a moment I was standing up, and the next I was out of the room on the landing, and I was still half dazed with sleep. I closed my door behind me. It was just chance that I did it. The lights were all out on the staircase and in the hall below. The curtains were drawn across the windows. There was no moon that night. I was in a darkness so complete that I could not see the glimmer of my hand when I raised it close before my face. Hanaud let the end of his cigarette drop at his feet. Betty had raised her face and was staring at Anne with her mouth parted. For all of them the garden had disappeared with its sunlight and its roses and its singing birds. They were upon that staircase with Ann Upcott in the black night. The swift changes of colour in her cheeks and of expression in her eyes, the nervous vividness of her, compelled them to follow with her. "Yes, mademoiselle," said Hanaud quietly. "The darkness didn't matter to me," she went on, with an amazement at her own fearlessness, now that she knew the after-history of that evening. "I am afraid now. I wasn't then," and Jim remembered how the night before in the garden her eyes had shifted from this dark spot to that in search of an intruder. Certainly she was afraid now. Her hands were clenched tight upon the arms of her chair, her lips shook. I knew every tread of the stairs. My hand was on the balustrade. There was no sound. It never occurred to me that anyone was awake except myself. I did not even turn on the light in the hall by the switch at the bottom of the stairs. I knew that there was a switch just inside the door of Betty's room, and that was enough. I think, too, that I didn't want to rouse anybody. At the foot of the stairs I turned right like a soldier. Exactly opposite to me across the hall was the door of Betty's room. I crossed the hall with my hands out in front of me, and Betty, as though she herself were crossing the hall, suddenly thrust both her hands out in front of her. "Yes, one would have to do that," she said slowly. "In the dark with nothing but space in front of one, yes." And then she smiled as she saw that Hanaud's eyes were watching her curiously. "Don't you think so, Monsieur Hanaud?" "No doubt," said he. "But let us not interrupt Mademoiselle." "I touched the wall first," Anne resumed, "just at the angle of the corridor and the hall. The corridor with the windows onto the courtyard on the one side and the doors of the receptions on the other." Hanaud asked. "Yes." "Were the curtains drawn across all those windows too, mademoiselle?" "Yes. There was not a glimmer of light anywhere. I felt my way along the wall to my right, that is, in the hall, of course, not the corridor, until my hands slipped off the surface and touched nothing. I had reached the embrasure of the doorway. I felt for the doorknob, turned it and entered the room. The light switch was in the wall at the side of the door, close to my left hand. I snapped it down. I think that I was still half asleep when I turned the light on in the treasure room, as we called it. But the next moment I was wide awake. Oh, I have never been more wide awake in my life. My fingers indeed were hardly off the switch after turning the light on, before they were back again turning the light off. But this time I eased the switch up very carefully, so that there should be no snap, no, not the tiniest sound to betray me. There was so short an interval between the two movements of my hand that I had just time to notice the clock on the top of the marquetry cabinet in the middle of the wall opposite to me, and then once more I stood in darkness, but stock-still and holding my breath, a little frightened, yes, no doubt a little frightened, but more astonished than frightened. For in the inner wall of the room, at the other end, close by the window, there, and Anne pointed to the second of those shuttered windows which stared so blankly on the garden, the door which was always locked since Simon Harlowe's death stood open and a bright light burned beyond. Betty Harlowe uttered a little cry. "That door?" she exclaimed, now at last really troubled. "It stood open? How can that have been?" Hanaud shifted his position in his chair, and asked her a question. "On which side of the door was the key, mademoiselle?" "On Madame's, if the key was in the lock at all." "Oh. You don't remember whether it was?" "No," said Betty. "Of course, both Anne and I were in and out of Madame's bedroom when she was ill, but there was a dressing room between the bedroom and the communicating door of my room, so that we should not have noticed." "To be sure," Hanaud agreed. "The dressing room in which the nurse might have slept and did when Madame had a seizure. Do you remember whether the communicating door was still open or unlocked on the next morning?" Betty frowned and reflected, and shook her head. "I cannot remember. We were all in great trouble. There was so much to do. I did not notice." "No. Indeed, why should you?" said Hanaud. He turned back to Anne. "Before you go on with this curious story, mademoiselle, tell me this. Was the light beyond the open door, a light in the dressing room or in the room beyond the dressing room, Madame Harlowe's bedroom, or didn't you notice?" "In the far room, I think," Anne answered confidently. "There would have been more light in the treasure room otherwise. The treasure room is long, no doubt, but where I stood I was completely in darkness. There was only this panel of yellow light in the open doorway. It lay in a band straight across the carpet, and it lit up the sedan chair opposite the doorway until it all glistened like silver." "Oh, there is a sedan chair in that museum?" said Hanaud lightly. "It will be interesting to see. So the light, mademoiselle, came from the far room?" "The light and the voices," said Anne with a quaver in her throat. "Voices!" cried Hanaud. He sat up straight in his chair, whilst Betty Harlowe went as white as a ghost. "Voices! What is this? Did you recognize those voices?" "One, Madame's, there was no mistaking it. It was loud and violent for a moment. Then it went off into a mumble of groans. The other voice only spoke once and very few words and very clearly. But it spoke in a whisper. There was, too, a sound of movements." "Movements?" said Hanaud sharply, and with his voice his face seemed to sharpen too. "Here's a word which does not help us much. A procession moves. So does the chair if I push it. So does my hand if I cover a mouth and stop a cry. Is it that sort of movement you mean, mademoiselle?" Under the stern insistence of his questions, Ann Upcott suddenly weakened. "Oh, I am afraid so," she said with a loud cry, and she clapped her hands to her face. "I never understood until this morning when you spoke of how the arrow might be used. Oh, I shall never forgive myself. I stood in the darkness, a few yards away, no more. I stood quite still and listened, and just beyond the lighted doorway Madame was being killed." She drew her hands from her face and beat upon her knees with her clenched fists in a frenzy. "Yes, I believe that now," Madame cried in the hoarse, harsh voice we knew. "Stripped, eh? Stripped to the skin." And she laughed wildly, and then came the sound, as though, yes, it might have been that. As though she were forced down and held, and Madame's voice died to a mumble and then silence and then the other voice in a low, clear whisper, "That will do now." And all the while I stood in the darkness. Oh. What did you do after that clear whisper reached your ears? Hanaud commanded. "Take your hands from your face, if you please, and let me hear." Ann Upcott obeyed him. She flung her head back with the tears streaming down her face. I turned, she whispered. I went out of the room. I closed the door behind me, oh, ever so gently. I fled. Fled? Fled? Where to? Up the stairs. To my room. And you rang no bell? You roused no one? You fled to your room. You hid your head under the bedclothes like a child. Come, come, mademoiselle. Hanaud broke off his savage irony to ask, and whose voice did you think it was that whispered so clearly, that will do now? The strangers you spoke of in the library this morning? No, monsieur, Anne replied. I could not tell. With a whisper one voice is like another. But you must have given that voice an owner. To run away and hide no one would do that. I thought it was Jean Bourdin's. And Hanaud sat back in his chair again, gazing at the girl with a look in which there was as much horror as incredulity. Jim Frobisher stood behind him ashamed of his very race. Could there be a more transparent subterfuge? If she thought that the nurse Jeanne Bourdin was in the bedroom, why did she turn and fly? Come, mademoiselle, said Hanaud. His voice had suddenly become gentle, almost pleading. You will not make me believe that. Ann Upcott turned with a helpless gesture towards Betty. You see, she said. Yes, Betty answered. She sat in doubt for a second or two and then sprang to her feet. Wait, she said, and before anyone could have stopped her she was skimming halfway across the garden to the house. Jim Frobisher wondered whether Hanaud had meant to stop her and then had given up the idea as quite out of the question. Certainly he had made some small quick movement, and even now, he watched Betty's flight across the broad lawn between the roses with an inscrutable queer look. To run like that, he said to Frobisher, with a boy's nimbleness and a girl's grace. It is pretty, eh? The long slim legs that twinkle, the body that floats. And Betty ran up the stone steps into the house. There was a tension in Hanaud's attitude with which his light words did not agree, and he watched the blank windows of the house with expectancy. Betty, however, was hardly a minute upon her errand. She reappeared upon the steps with a largish envelope in her hand and quickly rejoined the group. Monsieur, we have tried to keep this back from you, she said, without bitterness but with a deep regret. Yesterday, and today, just as we have tried for many years to keep it from all Dijon. But there is no help for it now. She opened the envelope and, taking out a cabinet photograph, handed it to Hanaud. This is the portrait of Madame my aunt at the time of her marriage with my uncle. It was the 3/4 length portrait of a woman, slender with the straight carriage of youth, in whose face a look of character had replaced youth's prettiness. It was a face made spiritual by suffering, the eyes shadowed and wistful, the mouth tender, and conveying even in the hard medium of a photograph some whimsical sense of humor. It made Jim Frobisher, gazing over Hanaud's shoulder, exclaim, not she was beautiful, but I would like to have known her. Yes. A companion, Hanaud added. Betty took a second photograph from the envelope. But this, monsieur, is the same lady a year ago. The second photograph had been taken at Monte Carlo, and it was difficult to believe that it was of the same woman, so tragic a change had taken place within those 10 years. Hanaud held the portraits side by side. The grace, the suggestion of humor had all gone, the figure had grown broad, the features coarse and heavy, the cheeks had fattened, the lips were pendulous, and there was nothing but violence in the eyes. It was a dreadful picture of collapse. It is best to be precise. Mademoiselle, said Hanaud gently, though these photographs tell their unhappy story clearly enough. Madame Harlowe, during the last years of her life, drank. Since my uncle's death, Betty explained. Her life, as very likely you know already, had been rather miserable and lonely before she married him. But she had a dream then on which to live. After Simon Harlowe died, however, and she ended her explanation with a gesture. Yes, Hanaud replied, of course, mademoiselle, we have known, Monsieur Frobisher and I, ever since we came into this affair that there was some secret. We knew it before your reticence of yesterday or Mademoiselle Upcott's of today. Waberski must have known of something which he would not care to have exposed before he threatened your lawyers in London, or brought his charges against you. Yes, he knew, and the doctors and the servants of course, who were very loyal. We did our best to keep our secret, but we could never be sure that we had succeeded. A friendly smile broadened Hanaud's face. Well, we can make sure now and here, he said, and both the girls and Jim stared at him. How? They exclaimed in an incredulous voice. Hanaud beamed. He held them in suspense. He spread out his hands. The artist, as he would have said, the mountebank as Jim Frobisher would have expressed it, had got the upper hand in him, and prepared his effect. By answering me one simple question, he said. Have either of you two ladies received an anonymous letter upon the subject? The test took them all by surprise, yet each one of them recognized immediately that they could hardly have a better. All the secrets of the town had been exploited at one time or another by this unknown person or group of persons, all the secrets, that is, except this one of Mrs. Harlowe's degradation. For Betty answered, no. I never received one. Nor I, added Anne. Then your secret is your secret still, said Hanaud. For how long now? Betty asked quickly, and Hanaud did not answer a word. He could make no promise without being false to what he had called his creed. It is a pity, said Betty wistfully. We have striven so hard, Anne and I, and she gave to the two men a glimpse of the life the two girls had led in the Maison Grenelle. We could do very little. We had neither of us any authority. We were both of us dependent upon Madame's generosity, and though no one could have been kinder when Madame was herself, she was not easy when she had the attacks. There was too much difference in age between us and her for us really to do anything but keep guard. She would not brook interference, she drank alone in her bedroom, she grew violent and threatening if anyone interfered. She would turn them all into the street. If she needed any help she could ring for the nurse, as indeed she sometimes, though rarely, did. It was a dreadful and wearing life as Betty Harlowe described it for the two young sentinels. We were utterly in despair, Betty continued. For Madame, of course, was really ill with her heart, and we always feared some tragedy would happen. This letter which Anne was to write when I was at Monsieur de Poulac's ball seemed our one chance. It was to a doctor in England, he called himself a doctor at all events, who advertised that he had a certain remedy which could be given without the patient's knowledge in her food and drink. Oh, I had no faith in it, but we had got to try it. Hanaud looked round at Frobisher triumphantly. What did I say to you, Monsieur Frobisher, when you wanted to ask a question about this letter? You see. These things disclose themselves in their due order if you leave them alone. The triumph went out of his voice. He rose to his feet and, bowing to Betty with an unaffected stateliness and respect, he handed her back the photographs. Mademoiselle, I am very sorry, he said. It is clear that you and your friend have lived amongst difficulties which we did not suspect. And, for the secret, I shall do what I can. Jim quite forgave him the snub which had been administered to him for the excellence of his manner towards Betty. He had a hope even that now he would forswear his creed, so that the secret might still be kept and the young sentinels receive their reward for their close watch. But Hanaud sat down again in his chair, and once more turned towards Ann Upcott. He meant to go on then. He would not leave well alone. Jim was all the more disappointed, because he could not but realize that the case was more and more clearly building itself from something unsubstantial into something solid, from a conjecture to an argument, this case against someone. Chapter 10 The Clock upon the Cabinet. Ann Upcott's story was in the light of this new disclosure intelligible enough. Standing in the darkness, she had heard, as she thought, Mrs. Harlowe in one of her violent outbreaks. Then with a sense of relief she had understood that Jeanne Bourdin the nurse was with Mrs. Harlowe, controlling and restraining her and finally administering some sedative. She had heard the outcries diminish and cease and a final whisper from the nurse to her patient or even perhaps to herself, "That will do now." Then she had turned and fled, taking care to attract no attention to herself. Real cowardice had nothing to do with her flight. The crisis was over. Her intervention, which before would only have been a provocation to a wilder outburst on the part of Mrs. Harlowe, was now altogether without excuse. It would once more have aroused the invalid, and next day would have added to the discomfort and awkwardness of life in the Maison Grenelle. For Mrs. Harlowe sober would have known that Anne had been a witness of one more of her dreadful exhibitions. The best thing which Anne could do, she did, given that her interpretation of the scene was the true one. She ran noiselessly back in the darkness to her room. "Yes," said Hanaud. "But you believe now that your interpretation was not correct. You believe now that whilst you stood in the darkness with the door open and the light beyond, Madame Harlowe was being murdered, coldly and cruelly murdered a few feet away from you." Ann Upcott shivered from head to foot. "I don't want to believe it," she cried. "It's too horrible." "You believe now that the one who whispered that will do now, was not Jean Bourdin," Hanaud insisted, "but some unknown person, and that the whisper was uttered after murder had been done by a third person in that room." Anne twisted her body from this side to that, she wrung her hands. "I am afraid of it," she moaned. "And what is torturing you now, mademoiselle, is remorse that you did not step silently forward and from the darkness of the treasure room look through that lighted doorway." He spoke with a great consideration, and his insight into her distress was in its way a solace to her. "Yes," she exclaimed eagerly. "I told you this morning I could have hindered it. I didn't understand until this morning. You see, that night something else happened, and now indeed stark fear drew the color from her cheeks and shone in her eyes." "Something else?" Betty asked with a quick indraw of her breath, and she shifted her chair a little so that she might face Anne. She was wearing a black coat over a white silk shirt open at the throat, and she took her handkerchief from a side pocket of the coat and drew it across her forehead. "Yes, mademoiselle," Hanaud explained. "It is clear that something else happened that night to your friend, something which, taken together with our talk this morning over the Book of Arrows, had made her believe that murder was done." He looked at Anne. "You went then to your room?" Anne resumed her story. "I went to bed. I was very, what shall I say, disturbed by Madame's outburst, as I thought it. One never knew what was going to happen in this house. It was on my nerves. For a time I tumbled from side to side in my bed. I was in a fever. Then suddenly I was asleep, sound asleep. But only for a time. I woke up and it was still pitch dark in my room. There was not a thread of light from the shutters. I turned over from my side onto my back and I stretched out my arms above my head. As God is my judge, I touched a face, and even after all these days the terror of that moment was so vivid and fresh to her that she shuddered and a little sob broke from her lips. A face quite close to me bending over me, in silence. I drew my hands away with a gasp. My heart was in my throat. I lay just for a second or two dumb, paralyzed. Then my voice came back to me and I screamed. It was the look of the girl as she told her story, perhaps more than the words she used, but something of her terror spread like a contagion amongst her hearers. Jim Frobisher's shoulders worked uneasily. Betty, with her big eyes wide open, her breath suspended, hung upon Anne's narrative. Hanaud himself said, "You screamed? I do not wonder. I knew that no one could hear me and that lying down I was helpless," Anne continued. "I sprang out of bed in a panic, and now I touched no one. I was so scared out of my wits that I had lost all sense of direction. I couldn't find the switch of the electric light. I stumbled along a wall feeling with my hands. I heard myself sobbing as though I was a stranger. At last I knocked against a chest of drawers and came a little to myself. I found my way then to the switch and turned on the light. The room was empty. I tried to tell myself that I had been dreaming, but I knew that the tale wasn't true. Someone had been stealthily bending down close, oh, so close over me in the darkness. My hand that had touched the face seemed to tingle. I asked myself with a shiver, what would have happened to me if just at that moment I had not waked up? I stood and listened, but the beating of my heart filled the whole room with noise. I stole to the door and laid my ear against the panel. Oh, I could easily have believed that one after another an army was creeping on tiptoe past my door. At last I made up my mind. I flung the door open wide. For a moment I stood back from it, but once the door was open I heard nothing. I stole out to the head of the great staircase. Below me the hall was as silent as an empty church. I think that I should have heard a spider stir. I suddenly realized that the light was streaming from my room and that some of it must reach me. I cried at once, "Who's there?" And then I ran back to my room and locked myself in. I knew that I should sleep no more that night. I ran to the windows and threw open the shutters. The night had cleared, the stars were bright in a clean black sky, and there was a freshness of daylight in the air. I had been, I should think, about 5 minutes at the window when, you know perhaps, monsieur, how the clocks in Dijon clash out and take up the hour from one another and pass it on to the hills. All of them struck 3. I stayed by the window until the morning came. After she had finished, no one spoke for a little while. Then Hanaud slowly lit another cigarette, looking now upon the ground, now into the air, anywhere except at the faces of his companions. "So this alarming thing happened just before 3 o'clock in the morning?" he asked gravely. "You are very sure of that, I suppose? For, you see, it may be of the utmost importance." "I am quite sure, monsieur," she said. "And you have told this story to no one until this moment?" "To no one in the world," replied Anne. The next morning Madame Harlowe was found dead. There were the arrangements for the funeral. Then came Monsieur Boris's accusation. There were troubles enough in the house without my adding to them. Besides, no one would have believed my story of the face in the darkness, and I didn't of course associate it then with the death of Mrs. Harlowe. "No," Hanaud agreed. "For you believed that death to have been natural." "Yes, and I am not sure that it wasn't natural now," Anne protested. "But today I had to tell you this story, Monsieur Hanaud," and she leaned forward in her chair and claimed his attention with her eyes, her face, every tense muscle of her body. "Because if you are right and murder was done in this house on the 27th, I know the exact hour when it was done." "Ah." Hanaud nodded his head once or twice slowly. He gathered up his feet beneath him. His eyes glittered very brightly as he looked at Anne. He gave Frobisher the queer impression of an animal crouching to spring. "The clock upon the marquetry cabinet," he said, "against the middle of the wall in the treasure room. The white face of it and the hour which leapt at you during that fraction of a second when your fingers were on the switch." "Yes," said Anne with a slow and quiet emphasis. "The hour was 10:30. With that statement the tension was relaxed. Betty's tightly clenched hand opened and her trifle of a handkerchief fluttered down on the grass. Hanaud changed from that queer attitude of a crouching animal. Jim Frobisher drew a great breath of relief. "Yes, that is very important," said Hanaud. "Important? I should think it was," cried Jim. For this was clear and proven to him. If murder had been done on the night of the 27th of April, there was just one person belonging to the household of the Maison Grenelle who could have no share in it, and that one person was his client, Betty Harlowe. Betty was stooping to pick up her handkerchief when Hanaud spoke to her, and she drew herself erect again with a little jerk. "Does that clock on the marquetry cabinet keep good time, mademoiselle?" he asked. "Very good," she answered. "Monsieur Sabin, the watchmaker in the Rue de la Liberté, has had it more than once to clean. It is an 8-day clock. It will be going when the seals are broken this afternoon. You will see for yourself." Hanaud, however, accepted her declaration on the spot. He rose to his feet and bowed to her with a certain formality but with a smile which redeemed it. At 10:30 Mademoiselle Harlowe was dancing at the house of M. de Poulac on the Boulevard Thiers, he said. "Of that there is no doubt. Inquiries have been made. Mademoiselle did not leave that house until after 1 in the morning. There is evidence enough of that to convince her worst enemy, from her chauffeur and her dancing partners to M. de Poulac's coachman, who stood at the bottom of the steps with a lantern during that evening and remembers to have held open for Mademoiselle the door of her car when she went away." "So that's that," said Jim to himself. Betty at all events was out of the net for good. And with that certainty there came a revolution in his thoughts. Why shouldn't Hanaud's search go on? It was interesting to watch the building up of this case against an unknown criminal, a case so difficult to bring to its proper conclusion in the court of assize, a case of poison where there was no trace of poison, a case where out of a mass of conjectures, here and there and more definite facts were coming into view, just as more and more masts of ships stand up out of a tumbled sea, the nearer one approaches land. Yes, now he wanted Hanaud to go on, delving astutely, letting, in his own phrase, things disclose themselves in their due sequence. But there was one point which Hanaud had missed, which should be brought to his notice. The mouse once more, he thought with all a man's vanity in his modesty, would come to the help of the netted lion. He cleared his throat. "Miss Anne, there is one little question I would like to ask you," he began, and Hanaud turned upon him, to his surprise, with a face of thunder. "You wish to ask a question?" he said. "Well, monsieur, ask it if you wish. It is your right." His manner added what his voice left unsaid, "and your responsibility." Jim hesitated. He could see no harm in the question he proposed to ask. It was of vital importance. Yet Hanaud stood in front of him with a lowering face, daring him to put it. Jim did not doubt any longer that Hanaud was quite aware of his point and yet for some unknown reason objected to its disclosure. Jim yielded, but not with a very good grace. "It is nothing," he said surlily, and Hanaud at once was all cheerfulness again. "Then we will adjourn," he said, looking at his watch. "It is nearly 1 o'clock. Shall we say 3 for the commissaire of police?" "Yes?" "Then I shall inform him and we will meet in the library at 3 and, with a little bow to Betty, the interdict shall be raised." "At 3, then," she said gaily. She sprang up from her chair, stooped, picked up her handkerchief with a swift and supple movement, twirled upon her heel and cried, "Come along, Anne." The 4 people moved off towards the house. Betty looked back. "You have left your gloves behind you on your chair," she said suddenly to Hanaud. Hanaud looked back. "So I have," he said, and then in a voice of protest, "Oh, mademoiselle," for Betty had already darted back and now returned dangling the gloves in her hand. "Mademoiselle, how shall I thank you?" he asked as he took them from her. Then he cocked his head at Frobisher, who was looking a little stiff. "Ha, ha, my young friend," he said with a grin. "You do not like that so much kindness should be shown me, no. You are looking very proper. You have the poker in the back. But ask yourself this, what are youth and good looks compared with Hanaud?" No, Jim Frobisher did not like Hanaud at all when the urchin got the upper hand in him. And the worst of it was that he had no rejoinder. He flushed very red, but he really had no rejoinder. They walked in silence to the house, and Hanaud, picking up his hat and stick, took his leave by the courtyard and the big gates. Anne drifted into the library. Jim felt a touch upon his arm. Betty was standing beside him with a smile of amusement upon her face. "You didn't really mind my going back for his gloves, did you?" she asked. "Say you didn't, Jim." And the amusement softened into tenderness. "I wouldn't have done it for worlds if I had thought you'd have minded." Jim's ill humor vanished like mist on a summer morning. "Mind?" he cried. "You shall pin a rose in his buttonhole if it pleases you, and all I'll say will be, you might do the same for me." Betty laughed and gave his arm a friendly squeeze. "We are friends again, then," she said, and the next moment she was out on the steps under the glass face of the porch. "Lunch at 2, Anne," she cried. "I must walk all the grime of this morning out of my brain." She was too quick and elusive for Jim Frobisher. She had something of Ariel in her conception, a delicate creature of fire and spirit and air. She was across the courtyard and out of sight in the street of Charles Robert before he had quite realized that she was going. He turned doubtfully towards the library, where Ann Upcott stood in the doorway. "I had better follow her," he said, reaching for his hat. Anne smiled and shook her head wisely. "I shouldn't. I know Betty. She wants to be alone." "Do you think so?" "I am sure." Jim twiddled his hat in his hands, not half as sure upon the point as she was. Anne watched him with a rather rueful smile for a little while. Then she shrugged her shoulders in a sudden exasperation. "There is something you ought to do," she said. "You ought to let Monsieur Bex, Betty's notary here, know that the seals are to be broken this afternoon. He ought to be here. He was here when they were affixed. Besides, He has all the keys of Mrs Harlowe's drawers and cupboards. That's true, Jim exclaimed. I'll go at once. Anne gave him Monsieur Box's address in the Place Etienne de Lay, and from the window of the library watched him go upon his errand. She stood at the window for a long while after he had disappeared. Chapter 11. A new suspect. Monsieur Bex the notary came out into the hall of his house when Frobisher sent his card in to him. He was a small, brisk man with a neat pointed beard, his hair cut en brosse and the corner of his napkin tucked into his neck between the flaps of his collar. Jim explained that the seals were to be removed from the rooms of the Maison Grenelle, but said nothing at all of the new developments which had begun with the discovery of the Book of the Arrows. I have had communications with Messrs. Frobisher and Hazlitt, the little man exclaimed. Everything has been as correct as it could possibly be. I am happy to meet a partner of so distinguished a firm. Yes. I will certainly present myself at 3 with my keys and see the end of this miserable scandal. It has been a disgrace. That young lady so delicious and so correct. And that animal of a Waberski. But we can deal with him. We have laws in France. He gave Jim the impression that there were in his opinion no laws anywhere else, and he bowed his visitor into the street. Jim returned by the Rue des Gaudrons and the main thoroughfare of the town, the Street of Liberty. As he crossed the semicircle of the Place d'Armes in front of the Hôtel de Ville, he almost ran into Hanaud smoking a cigar. You have lunched already? He cried. An affair of a quarter of an hour, said Hanaud with a wave of the hand. And you? Not until 2. Miss Harlowe wanted a walk. Hanaud smiled. How I understand that. The first walk after an ordeal. The first walk of a convalescent after an operation. The first walk of a defendant found innocent of a grave charge. It must be worth taking, that walk. But console yourself, my friend, for the postponement of your luncheon. You have met me. And he struck something of an attitude. Now Jim had the gravest objection to anything theatrical, especially when displayed in public places, and he answered stiffly, that is a pleasure, to be sure. Hanaud grinned. To make Jim look proper was becoming to him an unfailing entertainment. Now I reward you, he said, though for what Jim could not imagine. You shall come with me. At this hour, on the top of old Philippe Le Bon's terrace tower, we shall have the world to ourselves. He led the way into the great courtyard of the Hôtel de Ville. Behind the long wing which faced them, a square, solid tower rose 150 feet high above the ground. With Frobisher at his heels, Hanaud climbed the 316 steps and emerged upon the roof into the blue and gold of a cloudless May in France. They looked eastwards, and the beauty of the scene took Frobisher's breath away. Just in front, the slender apse of Notre Dame, fine as a lady's ornament, set him wondering how in the world through all these centuries it had endured, and beyond, rich and green and wonderful, stretched the level plain with its shining streams and nestling villages. Hanaud sat down upon a stone bench and stretched out his arm across the parapet. Look! He cried eagerly, proudly. There is what I brought you here to see. Look! Jim looked and saw, and his face lit up. Far away on the horizon's edge, unearthly in its beauty, hung the great mass of Mont Blanc, white as silver, soft as velvet, and here and there sparkling with gold, as though the flame of a fire leapt and sank. Oh ho! Said Hanaud as he watched Jim's face. So we have that in common. You perhaps have stood on the top of that mountain? 5 times, Jim answered, with a smile made up of many memories. I hope to do so again. You are fortunate, said Hanaud a little enviously. For me I see him only in the distance. But even so, if I am troubled, it is like sitting silent in the company of a friend. Jim Frobisher's mind strayed back over memories of snow slope and rock ridge. It was a true phrase which Hanaud had used. It expressed one of the many elusive, almost incommunicable emotions which mountains did mean to the people who had that, the passion for mountains in common. Jim glanced curiously at Hanaud. You are troubled about this case, then? He said sympathetically. The distant and exquisite vision of that soaring arc of silver and velvet set in the blue air brought the two men into at all events a momentary brotherhood. Very, Hanaud returned slowly, without turning his eyes from the horizon, and for more reasons than one. What do you yourself think of it? I think, Monsieur Hanaud, Jim said dryly, that you do not like anyone to ask any questions except yourself. Hanaud laughed with an appreciation of the thrust. Yes, you wish to ask a question of the beautiful Mademoiselle Upcott. Tell me if I have guessed aright the question you meant to ask. It was whether the face she touched in the darkness was the smooth face of a woman or the face of a man. Yes. That was it. It was now for Hanaud to glance curiously and quickly at Jim. There could be no doubt of the thought which was passing through his mind: I must begin to give you a little special attention, my friend. But he was careful not to put his thoughts into words. I did not want that question asked, he said. Why? Because it was unnecessary, and unnecessary questions are confusing things which had best be avoided altogether. Jim did not believe one word of that explanation. He had too clear a recollection of the swift movement and the look with which Hanaud had checked him. Both had been unmistakably signs of alarm. Hanaud would not have been alarmed at the prospect of a question being asked, merely because the question was superfluous. There was another and, Jim was sure, a very compelling reason in Hanaud's mind. Only he could not discover it. Besides, was the question superfluous? Surely, Hanaud replied. Suppose that young lady's hand had touched in the darkness the face of a man with its stubble, its tough skin, and the short hair of his head around it, bending down so low over hers, would not that have been the most vivid, terrifying thing to her in all the terrifying incident? Stretching out her hands carelessly above her head, she touches suddenly, unexpectedly, the face of a man? She could not have told her story at all without telling that. It would have been the unforgettable detail, the very heart of her terror. She touched the face of a man. Jim recognized that the reasoning was sound, but he was no nearer to the solution of his problem. Why Hanaud so wholeheartedly objected to the question being asked. And then Hanaud made a quiet remark which drove it for a long time altogether out of Jim's speculations. Mademoiselle Anne touched the face of a woman in the darkness that night, if that night, in the darkness, she touched a face at all. Jim was utterly startled. You believe that she was lying to us? He cried. Hanaud shook a protesting hand in the air. I believe nothing, he said. I am looking for a criminal. Ann Upcott. Jim spoke the name in amazement. Ann Upcott. Then he remembered the look of her as she had told her story, her face convulsed with terror, her shaking tones. Oh, it's impossible that she was lying. Surely no one could have so mimicked fear? Hanaud laughed. You may take this from me, my friend. All women who are great criminals are also very artful actresses. I never knew one who wasn't. Ann Upcott. Jim Frobisher once more exclaimed, but now with a trifle less of amazement. He was growing slowly and gradually accustomed to the idea. Still, that girl with the radiant look of young spring. Oh, no. Ann Upcott was left nothing in Mrs Harlowe's will, he argued. What could she have to gain by murder? Wait, my friend. Look carefully at her story. Analyze it. You will see, what? That it falls into two parts. Hanaud ground the stump of his cigar beneath his heel, offered one of his black cigarettes to Jim Frobisher and lighted one for himself. He lit it with a sulphur match which Jim thought would never stop fizzling, would never burst into flame. One part when she was alone in her bedroom, a little story of terror and acted very effectively, but after all anyone could invent it. The other part was not so easy to invent. The communicating door open for no reason, the light beyond, the voice that whispered, that will do, the sound of the struggle. No, my friend, I don't believe that was invented. There were too many little details which seemed to have been lived through. The white face of the clock and the hour leaping at her. No, I think all that must stand. But adapt it a little. See. This morning Waberski told us a story of the street of Gambetta and of Jean Clavel. Yes, said Jim. And I asked you afterwards whether Waberski might not be telling a true story of himself and attributing it to Mademoiselle Harlowe? Yes. Well, then, interpret Ann Upcott's story in the same way, continued Hanaud. Suppose that sometime that day she had unlocked the communicating door. What more easy? Madame Harlowe was up during the daytime. Her room was empty. And that communicating door opened not into Madame's bedroom, where perhaps it might have been discovered whether it was locked or not, but into a dressing room. Yes, Jim agreed. Well then, continue. Ann Upcott is left alone after Mademoiselle Harlowe's departure to Monsieur de Poulac's ball. She sends Gaston to bed. The house is all dark and asleep. Suppose then that she is joined by someone with the arrow poison already in the hypodermic needle. That they enter the treasure room just as Ann Upcott described. That she turns on the light for a second whilst someone crosses the treasure room and opens the door. Suppose that the voice which whispered, "That will do now," was the voice of Ann Upcott herself and that she whispered it across Madame Harlowe's body to the third person in that room. The someone, exclaimed Jim. But, who then? Who? Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. Why not Waberski? Waberski? Cried Jim with a new excitement in his voice. You asked me what had Ann Upcott to gain by this murder and you answered your own question. Nothing, you said, Monsieur Frobisher, but did your quick answer cover the ground? Waberski at all events expected a fine fat legacy. What if he in return for help proposed to share that fine fat legacy with the exquisite Mademoiselle Anne? Has she no motive now? In the end, what do we know of her at all except that she is the paid companion and therefore poor? Mademoiselle Anne. And he threw up his hands. Where does she spring from? How did she come into that house? Was she perhaps Waberski's friend? And a cry from Jim brought Hanaud to a stop. Jim had thought of Waberski as the possible murderer if murder had been done, a murderer who, disappointed of his legacy, the profits of his murder, had carried on his villainy to blackmail and a false accusation. But he had not associated Ann Upcott with him until those moments on the terrace tower. Yet now memories began to crowd upon him. The letter to him, for instance. She had said that Waberski had claimed her support and ridiculed his claim. Might that letter not have been a blind and a rather cunning blind? Above all, there was a scene passing vividly through his mind which was very different from the scene spread out before his eyes, a scene of lighted rooms and a crowd about a long green table, and a fair slender girl seated at the table who lost and lost until the whole of her little pile of banknotes was swept in by the croupier's rake, and then turned away with a high carriage and a quivering lip. Aha! Said Hanaud keenly. You know something after all of Ann Upcott, my friend. What do you know? Jim hesitated. At one moment it did not seem fair to her that he should relate his story. Explained, it might wear so different a complexion. At another moment that it would be fairer to let her explain it. And there was Betty to consider. Yes, above all there was Betty to consider. He was in Dijon on her behalf. I will tell you, he said to Hanaud. When I saw you in Paris, I told you that I had never seen Ann Upcott in all my life. I believed it. It wasn't until she danced into the library yesterday morning that I realized I had misled you. I saw Ann Upcott at the Trente Quarante table at the Sporting Club in Monte Carlo in January of this year. I sat next to her. She was quite alone and losing her money. Nothing would go right for her. She bore herself proudly and well. The only sign I saw of distress was the tightening of her fingers about her little handbag, and a look of defiance thrown at the other players when she rose after her last coup, as though she dared them to pity her. I was on the other hand winning, and I slipped a 1,000-franc note off the table onto the floor, keeping my heel firmly upon it as you can understand. And as the girl turned to move out from the crowd I stopped her. I said in English, for she was obviously of my race, "This is yours. You have dropped it on the floor." She gave me a smile and a little shake of the head. I think that for the moment she dared not trust her lips to speak, and in a second, of course, she was swallowed up in the crowd. I played for a little while longer. Then I too rose, and as I passed the entrance to the bar on my way to get my coat, this girl rose up from one of the many little tables and spoke to me. She called me by my name. She thanked me very prettily and said that although she had lost that evening, she was not really in any trouble. I doubted the truth of what she said. For she had not one ring upon any finger, not the tiniest necklace about her throat, not one ornament upon her dress or in her hair. She turned away from me at once and went back to the little table where she sat down again in the company of a man. The girl, of course, was Ann Upcott, the man Waberski. It was from him, no doubt, that she had got my name. Did this little episode happen before Ann Upcott became a member of the household? Hanaud asked. Yes, replied Jim. I think she joined Mrs Harlowe and Betty at Monte Carlo. I think that she came with them back to Dijon. No doubt, said Hanaud. He sat for a little while in silence. Then he said softly, that does not look so very well for Mademoiselle Anne. Jim had to admit that it did not. But consider this, Monsieur Hanaud, he urged. If Ann Upcott, which I will not believe, is mixed up in this affair, why should she of her own free will volunteer this story of what she heard upon the night of the 27th and invent that face which bent down over her in the darkness? I have an idea about that, Hanaud replied. She told us this story, when? After I had said that we must have the seals broken this afternoon and the rooms thrown open. It is possible that we may come upon something in those rooms which makes it wise for her to divert suspicion upon some other woman in the house. Jeanne Bourdin, or even Mademoiselle Harlowe's maid, Francine Rollard. But not Mademoiselle Betty, Jim interposed quickly. No, no. Hanaud returned with a wave of his hand. The clock upon the marquetry cabinet settled that. Mademoiselle Betty is out of the affair. Well, this afternoon we shall see. Meanwhile, my friend, you will be late for your luncheon. Hanaud rose from the bench, and with a last look at the magical mountain, that outpost of France, they turned towards the city. Jim Frobisher looked down upon tiny squares green with limes and the steep gaily patterned roofs of ancient houses. About him the fine tapering spires leapt high like lances from the slates of its many churches. A little to the south and a quarter of a mile away across the rooftops he saw the long ridge of a big house and the smoke rising from a chimney stack or two, and behind it the tops of tall trees which rippled and shook the sunlight from their leaves. The Maison Grenelle, he said. There was no answer, not even the slightest movement at his side. Isn't it? He asked. And he turned. Hanaud had not even heard him. He was gazing also towards the Maison Grenelle with the queerest look upon his face, a look with which Jim was familiar in some sort of association, but which for a moment or two he could not define. It was not an expression of amazement. On the other hand, interest was too weak a word. Suddenly Jim Frobisher understood, and comprehension brought with it a sense of discomfort. Hanaud's look, very bright and watchful and more than a little inhuman, was just the look of a good retriever dog when his master brings out a gun. Jim looked again at the high ridge of the house. The slates were broken at intervals by little gabled windows, but at none of them could he see a figure. From none of them a signal was waved. "What is it that you are looking at?" asked Jim in perplexity, and then with a touch of impatience, "You see something, I'm sure." Hanaud heard his companion at last. His face changed in a moment, lost its rather savage vigilance, and became the face of a buffoon. "Of course I see something. Always I see something. Am I not Hanaud? Ah, my friend, the responsibility of being Hanaud. Aren't you fortunate to be without it? Pity me. For the Hanauds must see something everywhere even when there is nothing to see. Come." He bustled out of the sunlight on that high platform into the dark turret of the staircase. The two men descended the steps and came out again into the semicircle of the Place d'Armes. "Well," said Hanaud, and then yes, as though he had some little thing to say and was not quite sure whether he would say it. Then he compromised. "You shall take a vermouth with me before you go to your luncheon," he said. "I should be late if I did," Frobisher replied. Hanaud waved the objection aside with a shake of his outstretched forefinger. "You have plenty of time, monsieur. You shall take a vermouth with me, and you will still reach the Maison Grenelle before Mademoiselle Harlowe. I say that, Hanaud, he said superbly, and Jim laughed and consented. I shall plead your vanity as my excuse when I find her and Ann Upcott half through their meal. A café stands at the corner of the Street of Liberty and the Place d'Armes, with 2 or 3 little tables set out on the pavement beneath an awning. They sat down at one of them, and over the vermouth, Hanaud was once more upon the brink of some recommendation or statement. You see, he began, and then once more ran away. So you have been 5 times upon the top of the Mont Blanc, he said. From Chamonix? Once, Jim replied. Once from the Col du Géant by the Brenva Glacier. Once by the Dôme route. Once from the Brouillard Glacier. And the last time by the Mont Mandit. Hanaud listened with genuine friendliness and said, You tell me things which are interesting and very new to me, he said warmly. I am grateful, monsieur. On the other hand, Jim answered dryly, You, monsieur, tell me very little. Even what you brought me to this café to say, you are going to keep to yourself. But for my part I shall not be so churlish. I am going to tell you what I think. Yes? I think we have missed the way. Oh? Hanaud selected a cigarette from his bundle in its bright blue wrapping. You will perhaps think me presumptuous in saying so. Not the least little bit in the world, Hanaud replied seriously. We of the police are liable in searching widely to overlook the truth under our noses. That is our danger. Another angle of view, there is nothing more precious. I am all attention. Jim Frobisher drew his chair closer to the round table of iron and leaned his elbows upon it. I think there is one question in particular which we must answer if we are to discover whether Mrs. Harlowe was murdered, and if so by whom. Hanaud nodded. I agree, he said slowly. But I wonder whether we have the same question in our minds. It is a question which we have neglected. It is this: who put back the professor's treatise on Strophanthus in its place upon the bookshelf in the library, between midday yesterday and this morning? Hanaud struck another of his abominable matches, and held it in the shelter of his palm until the flame shone. He lit his cigarette and took a few puffs at it. No doubt that question is important, he admitted, although in rather an offhand way. But it is not mine. No. I think there is another more important still. I think if we could know why the door of the treasure room, which had been locked since Simon Harlowe's death, was unlocked on the night of the 27th of April, we should be very near to the whole truth of this dark affair. But, and he flung out his hands, that baffles me. Jim left him sitting at the table and staring moodily upon the pavement, as if he hoped to read the answer there. Chapter 12: The Breaking of the Seals. A few minutes later Jim Frobisher had to admit that Hanaud guessed very luckily. He would not allow that it was more than a guess. Monsieur Hanaud might be a thorough little Mr. Knoll, but no insight, however brilliant, could inform him of so accidental a circumstance. But there the fact was. Frobisher did arrive at the Maison Grenelle, to his great discomfort, before Betty Harlowe. He had loitered with Hanaud at the café just so that this might not take place. He shrank from being alone with Ann Upcott now that he suspected her. The most he could hope to do was to conceal the reason of his trouble. The trouble itself in her presence he could not conceal. She made his case the more difficult perhaps by a rather wistful expression of sympathy. You are distressed, she said gently. But surely you need not be any longer. What I said this morning was true. It was 10:30 when that dreadful whisper reached my ears. Betty was a mile away amongst her friends in a ballroom. Nothing can shake that. It is not on her account that I am troubled, he cried, and Anne looked at him with startled eyes. Betty crossed the court and joined them in the hall before Anne could ask a question, and throughout their luncheon he made conversation upon indifferent subjects with rapidity, if without entertainment. Fortunately there was no time to spare. They were still indeed smoking their cigarettes over their coffee when Gaston informed them that the commissaire of police with his secretary was waiting in the library. This is Mr. Frobisher, my solicitor in London, said Betty as she presented Jim. The commissaire, Monsieur Girardeau, was a stout, bald, middle-aged man with a pair of folding glasses sitting upon a prominent fat nose. His secretary, Maurice Thevenet, was a tall, good-looking novice in the police administration, a trifle flashy in his appearance, and in his own esteem, one would gather, rather a conqueror amongst the fair. "I have asked Monsieur Bex, Mademoiselle's notary in Dijon, to be present," said Jim. "That is quite in order," replied the commissaire, and Monsieur Bex was at that moment announced. He came on the very moment of 3. The clock was striking as he bowed in the doorway. Everything was just as it should be. Monsieur Bex was pleased. "With Monsieur le Commissaire's consent," he said, smiling, "we can now proceed with the final ceremonies of this affair." "We wait for Monsieur Hanaud," said the commissaire. "Hanaud?" "Hanaud of the Sûreté of Pans, who has been invited by the examining magistrate to take charge of this case," the commissaire explained. "Case?" cried Monsieur Bex in perplexity. "But there is no case for Hanaud to take charge of," and Betty Harlowe drew him a little aside. Whilst she gave the little notary some rapid summary of the incidents of the morning, Jim went out of the room into the hall in search of Hanaud. He saw him at once, but to his surprise Hanaud came forward from the back of the hall as if he had entered the house from the garden. "I sought you in the dining room," he said, pointing to the door of that room which certainly was at the back of the house behind the library, with its entrance behind the staircase. "We will join the others." Hanaud was presented to Monsieur Bex. "And this gentleman?" asked Hanaud, bowing slightly to Thevenet. "My secretary, Maurice Thevenet," said the commissaire, and in a loud undertone, "a charming youth, of an intelligence which is surprising. He will go far." Hanaud looked at Thevenet with a friendly interest. The young recruit gazed at the great man with kindling eyes. "This will be an opportunity for me, Monsieur Hanaud, by which, if I do not profit, I prove myself of no intelligence at all," he said, with a formal modesty which quite went to the heart of Monsieur Bex. "That is very correct," said he. Hanaud for his part was never averse to flattery. He cocked an eye at Jim Frobisher, he shook the secretary warmly by the hand. "Then don't hesitate to ask me questions, my young friend," he answered. "I am Hanaud now, yes. But I was once young Maurice Thevenet without, alas, his good looks." Maurice Thevenet blushed with the most becoming diffidence. "That is very kind," said Monsieur Bex. "This looks like growing into a friendly little family party," Jim Frobisher thought, and he quite welcomed a hum and a ha from the commissaire. He moved to the centre of the room. "We, A.E.W., commissaire of police, will now remove the seals," he said pompously. He led the way from the library across the hall and along the corridor to the wide door of Mrs Harlowe's bedroom. He broke the seals and removed the bands, then he took a key from the hand of his secretary and opened the door upon a shuttered room. The little company of people surged forward. Hanaud stretched out his arms and barred the way. "Just for a moment, please," he ordered, and over his shoulder Jim Frobisher had a glimpse of the room which made him shiver. This morning in the garden some thrill of the chase had made him for a moment eager that Hanaud should press on, that development should follow upon development until somewhere a criminal stood exposed. Since the hour, however, which he had spent upon the tower of the terrace, all thought of the chase appalled him, and he waited for developments in fear. This bedroom mistily lit by a few stray threads of daylight which pierced through the chinks of the shutters, cold and silent and mysterious, was for him peopled with phantoms, whose faces no one could see, who struggled dimly in the shadows. Then Hanaud and the commissaire crossed to the windows opposite, opened them and flung back the shutters. The clear bright light flooded every corner in an instant and brought to Jim Frobisher relief. The room was swept and clean, the chairs ranged against the wall, the bed flat and covered with an embroidered spread, everywhere there was order, it was as empty of suggestion as a vacant bedroom in an hotel. Hanaud looked about him. "Yes," he said. "This room stood open for a week after Madame's funeral. It would have been a miracle if we discovered anything which could help us." He went to the bed, which stood with its head against the wall midway between the door and the windows. A small flat stand with a button of enamel lay upon the round table by the bedside, and from the stand a cord ran down by the table leg and disappeared under the carpet. "This is the bell into what was the maid's bedroom, I suppose," he said, turning towards Betty. "Yes." Hanaud stooped and minutely examined the cord. But there was no sign that it had ever been tampered with. He stood up again. "Mademoiselle, will you take Monsieur Giraudeau into Jeanne Bourdin's bedroom and close the door? I shall press this button, and you will know whether the bell rings. Whilst we here shall be able to assure ourselves whether sounds made in one of the rooms would be heard in the other." "Certainly." Betty took the commissaire of police away, and a few seconds later those in Mrs Harlowe's room heard a door close in the corridor. "Will you shut our door now, if you please?" Hanaud requested. Bex, the notary, closed it. "Now, silence, if you please." Hanaud pressed the button, and not a sound answered him. He pressed it again and again with the same result. The commissaire returned to the bedroom. "Well?" Hanaud asked. "It rang twice," said the commissaire. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders with a laugh. "And an electric bell has a shrill, penetrating sound," he cried. "Name of a name, but they built good houses when the Maison Grenelle was built. Are the cupboards and drawers open?" He tried one and found it locked. Monsieur Bex came forward. All the drawers were locked on the morning when Madame Harlowe's death was discovered. Mademoiselle Harlowe herself locked them in my presence and handed to me the keys for the purpose of making an inventory. Mademoiselle was altogether correct in so doing. For until the funeral had taken place the terms of the will were not disclosed. But afterwards, when you took the inventory, you must have unlocked them. "I have not yet begun the inventory, Monsieur Hanaud. There were the arrangements for the funeral, a list of the properties to be made for valuation, and the vineyards to be administered." "Oh ho!" cried Hanaud alertly. "Then these wardrobes and cupboards and drawers should hold exactly what they held on the night of the 27th of April. He ran quickly about the room trying a door here, a drawer there, and came to a stop beside a cupboard fashioned in the thickness of the wall. The trouble is that a child with a bent wire could unlock any one of them. Do you know what Madame Harlowe kept in this, Monsieur Bex?" And Hanaud rapped with his knuckles upon the cupboard door. "No, I have no idea. Shall I open it?" And Bex produced a bunch of keys from his pocket. "Not for the moment, I think," said Hanaud. He had been dawdling over the locks and the drawers, as though time meant nothing to him at all. He now swung briskly back into the center of the room, making notes, it seemed to Frobisher, of its geography. The door opening from the corridor faced, across the length of the floor, the two tall windows above the garden. If one stood in the doorway facing these windows, the bed was on the left hand. On the corridor side of the bed, a second smaller door, which was half open, led to a white-tiled bathroom. On the window side of the bed was the cupboard in the wall about the height of a woman's shoulders. A dressing table stood between the windows, a great fireplace broke the right-hand wall, and in that same wall, close to the right-hand window, there was yet another door. Hanaud moved to it. "This is the door of the dressing room?" he asked of Ann Upcott, and without waiting for an answer pushed it open. Monsieur Bex followed upon his heels with his keys rattling. "Everything here has been locked up too," he said. Hanaud paid not the slightest attention. He opened the shutters. It was a narrow room without any fireplace at all, and with a door exactly opposite to the door by which Hanaud had entered. He went at once to this door, and this must be the communicating door which leads into what is called the treasure room, he said, and he paused with his hand upon the knob and his eyes ranging alertly over the faces of the company. "Yes," said Ann Upcott. Jim was conscious of a queer thrill. He thought of the opening of some newly discovered tomb of a pharaoh in a hillside of the Valley of Kings. Suspense passed from one to the other as they waited, but Hanaud did not move. He stood there impassive and still like some guardian image at the door of the tomb. Jim felt that he was never going to move, and in a voice of exasperation he cried, "Is the door locked?" Hanaud replied in a quiet but a singular voice. No doubt he, too, felt that strange current of emotion and expectancy which bound all in the room under a spell, and even gave to their diverse faces for a moment a kind of family similitude. "I don't know yet whether it's locked or not," he said. "But since this room is now the private sitting room of Mademoiselle Harlowe, I think that we ought to wait until she rejoins us." Monsieur Bex just had time to remark with approval, "That is very correct," before Betty's fresh, clear voice rang out from the doorway leading to Mrs Harlowe's bedroom, "I am here." Hanaud turned the handle. The door was not locked. It opened at a touch, inwards towards the group of people and upwards towards the corridor. The treasure room was before them, shrouded in dim light, but here and there a beam of light sparkled upon gold and held out a promise of wonders. Hanaud picked his way daintily to the windows and fastened the shutters back against the outside wall. "I beg that nothing shall be touched," he said as the others filed into the room. Chapter 13: Simon Harlowe's Treasure Room. Like the rest of the reception rooms along the corridor, it was longer than it was broad and more of a gallery than a room. But it had been arranged for habitation rather than for occasional visits. For it was furnished with a luxurious comfort and not overcrowded. In the fawn-coloured panels of the walls a few exquisite pictures by Fragonard had been framed, on the writing table of Chinese Chippendale by the window every appointment, inkstand, pen tray, candlestick, sand-caster and all were of the pink Battersea enamel and without a flaw. But they were there for use, not for exhibition. Moreover, a prominent big fireplace in the middle of the wall on the side of the hall jutted out into the room and gave it almost the appearance of two rooms in communication. The one feature of the room, indeed, which at a first glimpse betrayed the collector, was the sedan chair set in a recess of the wall by the fireplace and opposite to the door communicating with Mrs Harlowe's bedroom. Its body was of a pale French grey in colour, with elaborately carved mouldings in gold round the panels and medallions representing fashionable shepherds and shepherdesses daintily painted in the middle of them. It had glass windows at the sides to show off the occupant, and it was lined with pale grey satin, embroidered in gold to match the colour of the panels. The roof, which could be raised upon a hinge at the back, was ornamented with gold filigree work, and it had a door in front of which the upper part was glass. Altogether it was as pretty a gleaming piece of work as the art of carriage building could achieve, and a gilt rail very fitly protected it. Even Hanaud was taken by its daintiness. He stood with his hands upon the rail examining it with a smile of pleasure, until Jim began to think that he had quite forgotten the business which had brought him there. However, he brought himself out of his dream with a start. "A pretty world for rich people, Monsieur Frobisher," he said. "What pictures of fine ladies in billowy skirts and fine gentlemen in silk stockings. And what splashings of mud for the unhappy devils who had to walk." He turned his back to the chair and looked across the room. "That is the clock which marked 10:30, mademoiselle, during the moment when you had the light turned up?" he asked of Anne. "Yes," she answered quickly. Then she looked at it again. "Yes, that's it." Jim detected or fancied that he detected a tiny change in her intonation, as she repeated her assurance, not an inflection of doubt. It was not marked enough for that but of perplexity. It was clearly, however, fancy upon his part, for Hanaud noticed nothing at all. Jim pulled himself up with an unspoken remonstrance. "Take care," he warned himself. "For once you begin to suspect people, they can say and do nothing which will not provide you with material for suspicion." Hanaud was without doubt satisfied. The clock was a beautiful small gilt clock of the Louis XV period, shaped with a waist like a violin. It had a white face, and it stood upon a marquetry buhl cabinet, a little more than waist high, in front of a tall Venetian mirror. Hanaud stood directly in front of it and compared it with his watch. "It is exact to the minute, mademoiselle," he said to Betty with a smile as he replaced his watch in his pocket. He turned about, so that he stood with his back to the clock. He faced the fireplace across the narrow neck of the room. It had an Adam mantelpiece, fashioned from the same fawn-coloured wood as the panels, with slender pillars and some beautiful carving upon the board beneath the shelf. Above the shelf one of the Fragonards was framed in the wall, and apparently so that nothing should mask it, there were no high ornaments at all upon the shelf itself. One or two small boxes of Battersea enamel and a flat glass case alone decorated it. Hanaud crossed to the mantelshelf and, after a moment's inspection, lifted, with a low whistle of admiration, the flat glass case. "You will pardon me, mademoiselle," he said to Betty, "but I shall probably never in my life have the luck to see anything so incomparable again. and the mantelshelf is a little high for me to see it properly." Without waiting for the girl's consent, he carried it towards the window. "Do you see this, Monsieur Frobisher?" he called out, and Jim went forward to his side. The case held a pendant wrought in gold and chalcedony and translucent enamels by Benvenuto Cellini. Jim acknowledged that he had never seen craftsmanship so exquisite and delicate, but he chafed nonetheless at Hanaud's diversion from his business. "One could spend a long day in this room," the detective exclaimed, admiring these treasures. "No doubt," Jim replied dryly. "But I had a notion that we were going to spend an afternoon looking for an arrow." Hanaud laughed. "My friend, you recall me to my duty." He looked at the jewel again and sighed. "Yes, as you say, we are not visitors here to enjoy ourselves." He carried the case back again to the mantel shelf and replaced it. Then all at once his manner changed. He was leaning forward with his hands still about the glass case. But he was looking down. The fire grate was hidden from the room by a low screen of blue lacquer, and Hanaud, from the position in which he stood, could see over the screen into the grate itself. "What is all this?" he asked. He lifted the screen from the hearth and put it carefully aside. All now could see what had disturbed him, a heap of white ashes in the grate. Hanaud went down upon his knees, and picking up the shovel from the fender, he thrust it between the bars and drew it out again with a little layer of the ashes upon it. They were white and had been pulverized into atoms. There was not one flake which would cover a finger-nail. Hanaud touched them gingerly, as though he had expected to find them hot. "This room was sealed up on Sunday morning and today is Thursday afternoon," said Jim Frobisher with heavy sarcasm. "Ashes do not as a rule keep hot more than 3 days, Monsieur Hanaud." Maurice Thevenet looked at Frobisher with indignation. He was daring to make fun of Hanaud. He treated the Sûreté with no more respect than one might treat well, say Scotland Yard. Even Monsieur Bex had an air of disapproval. For a partner of the firm of Frobisher and Hazlitt, this gentleman was certainly not very correct. Hanaud, on the contrary, was milk and water. "I have observed it," he replied mildly, and he sat back upon his heels with the shovel still poised in his hands. "Mademoiselle," he called, and Betty moved forward and leaned against the mantelshelf at his side. "Who burnt these papers so very carefully?" he asked. "I did," Betty replied. "And when?" "On Saturday night, a few, and the rest on Sunday morning, before Monsieur E.A. Commissaire arrived." "And what were they, mademoiselle?" "Letters, monsieur." Hanaud looked up into her face quickly. "Oh ho," he said softly. "Letters. Yes. And what kind of letters, if you please?" Jim Frobisher was for throwing up his hands in despair. What in the world had happened to Hanaud? One moment he forgot altogether the business upon which he was engaged in his enjoyment of Simon Harlowe's collection. The next he was off on his wild goose chase after anonymous letters. Jim had not a doubt that he was thinking of them now. One had only to say letters, and he was sidetracked at once, apparently ready to accuse anyone of their authorship. "They were quite private letters," Betty replied, whilst the colour slowly stained her cheeks. "They will not help you." "So I see," Hanaud returned, with just a touch of a snarl in his voice as he shook the shovel and flung the ashes back into the grate. "But I am asking you, mademoiselle, what kind of letters these were?" Betty did not answer. She looked sullenly down at the floor, and then from the floor to the windows, and Jim saw with a stab of pain that her eyes were glistening with tears. "I think, Monsieur Hanaud, that we have come to a point when mademoiselle and I should consult together," he interposed. "Mademoiselle would certainly be within her rights," said Monsieur Bex. But mademoiselle waved her rights with a little petulant movement of her shoulders. "Very well." She showed her face now to them all, with the tears abrim in her big eyes, and gave Jim a little nod of thanks and recognition. "You shall be answered, Monsieur Hanaud," she said with a catch in her voice. "It seems that nothing, however sacred, but must be dragged out into the light. But I say again, those letters will not help you." She looked across the group to her notary. "Monsieur Bex," she said, and he moved forward to the other side of Hanaud. In Madame's bedroom, between her bed and the door of the bathroom, there stood a small chest in which she kept a good many unimportant papers, such as old receipted bills, which it was not yet wise to destroy. This chest I took to my office after Madame's death, of course with Mademoiselle's consent, meaning to go through the papers at my leisure and recommend that all which were not important should be destroyed. My time, however, was occupied, as I have already explained to you, and it was not until the Friday of the 6th of May that I opened the chest at all. On the very top I saw, to my surprise, a bundle of letters in which the writing had already faded, tied together with a ribbon. One glance was enough to assure me that they were very private and sacred things with which Mademoiselle's notary had nothing whatever to do. Accordingly, on the Saturday morning, I brought them back myself to Mademoiselle Betty. With a bow, Monsieur Bex retired and Betty continued the story. I put the letters aside so that I might read them quietly after dinner. As it happened, I could not in any case have given them attention before. For on that morning Monsieur Boris formulated his charge against me, and in the afternoon I was summoned to the office of the examining magistrate. As you can understand, I was, I don't say frightened but distressed by this accusation, and it was not until quite late in the evening, and then rather to distract my thoughts than for any other reason, that I looked at the letters. But as soon as I did look at them I understood that they must be destroyed. There were reasons, which, and her voice faltered, and with an effort again grew steady, which I feel it rather a sacrilege to explain. They were letters which passed between my Uncle Simon and Mrs Harlowe during the time when she was very unhappily married to Monsieur Raviat and living apart from him, sometimes long letters, sometimes little scraps of notes scribbled off without reserve, during a moment of freedom. They were letters of, and again her voice broke and died away into a whisper, so that none could misunderstand her meaning, of lovers speaking very intimate things, and glorying in their love. Oh, there was no doubt that they ought to be destroyed. But I made up my mind that I ought to read them, every one, first of all, lest there should be something in them which I ought to know. I read a good many that night and burnt them. But it grew late, I left the rest until the Sunday morning. I finished them on the Sunday morning, and what I had left over I burnt then. It was soon after I had finished burning them that Monsieur le Commissaire came to affix his seals. The ashes which you see there, Monsieur Hanaud, are the ashes of the letters which I burnt upon the Sunday morning. Betty spoke with a very pretty and simple dignity which touched her audience to a warm sympathy. Hanaud gently tilted the ashes back into the grate. "Mademoiselle, I am always in the wrong with you," he said with an accent of remorse. "For I am always forcing you to statements which make me ashamed and do you honor." Jim acknowledged that Hanaud, when he wished, could do the handsome thing with a very good grace. Unfortunately, grace seemed never to be an enduring quality in him, as, for instance, now. He was still upon his knees in front of the hearth. Whilst making his apology he had been raking amongst the ashes with the shovel without giving, to all appearance, any thought to what he was doing. But his attention was now arrested. The shovel had disclosed an unburnt fragment of bluish-white paper. Hanaud's body stiffened. He bent forward and picked the scrap of paper out from the grate, whilst Betty, too, stooped with a little movement of curiosity. Hanaud sat back again upon his heels. "So, you burnt more than letters last Sunday morning," he said. Betty was puzzled and Hanaud held out to her the fragment of paper. "Bills too, mademoiselle." Betty took the fragment in her hand and shook her head over it. It was obviously the right-hand top corner of a bill. For an intriguing scrap of a printed address was visible and below a figure or two in a column. "There must have been a bill or two mixed up with the letters," said Betty. "I don't remember it." She handed the fragment of paper back to Hanaud, who sat and looked at it. Jim Frobisher, standing just behind him, read the printed ends of names and words and the figures beneath and happened to remember the very look of them. Hanaud held them so long in his hand, the top bit of name in large capital letters, the words below echeloned in smaller capitals, then the figures in the columns, and all enclosed in a rough sort of triangle with the diagonal line browned and made ragged by the fire, thus: Iron. Struction. Uls. Is. 375.05. "Well, it is of no importance, luckily," said Hanaud, and he tossed the scrap of paper back into the grate. "Did you notice these ashes, Monsieur Girardeau, on Sunday morning?" He turned any slur the question might seem to cast upon Betty's truthfulness with an explanation. "It is always good when it is possible to get a corroboration, mademoiselle." Betty nodded, but Girardeau was at a loss. He managed to look extremely important, but importance was not required. "I don't remember," he said. However, corroboration of a kind at all events did come though from another source. "If I might speak, Monsieur Hanaud?" said Maurice Thevenet eagerly. "But by all means," Hanaud replied. "I came into this room just behind Monsieur Girardeau on the Sunday morning. I did not see any ashes in the hearth, that is true. But Mademoiselle Harlowe was in the act of arranging that screen of blue lacquer in front of the fireplace, just as we saw it today. She arranged it, and when she saw who her visitors were she stood up with a start of surprise." "Aha!" said Hanaud cordially. He smiled at Betty. "This evidence is just as valuable as if he had told us that he had seen the ashes themselves." He rose to his feet and went close to her. "But there is another letter which you were good enough to promise to me," he said. And she began, and Hanaud stopped her hurriedly. "It is better that we hold our tongues," he said with a nod and a grin which recognized that in this matter they were accomplices. "This is to be our exclusive little secret, which, if he is very good, we will share with Monsieur le Commissaire." He laughed hugely at his joke, whilst Betty unlocked a drawer in the Chippendale secretary. Girardeau the commissaire tittered, not quite sure that he thought very highly of it. Monsieur Bex, on the other hand, by a certain extra primness of his face, made it perfectly clear that in his opinion such a jape was very, very far from correct. Betty produced a folded sheet of common paper and handed it to Hanaud, who took it aside to the window and read it carefully. Then with a look he beckoned Girardeau to his side. "Monsieur Frobisher can come too. For he is in the secret," he added, and the three men stood apart at the window looking at the sheet of paper. It was dated the 7th of May, signed The Scourge, like the others of this hideous brood, and it began without any preface. There were only a few words typed upon it, and some of them were epithets not to be reproduced which made Jim's blood boil that a girl like Betty should ever have had to read them. "Your time is coming now, you," and here followed the string of abominable obscenities. "You are for it, Betty Harlowe. Hanaud the detective from Paris is coming to look after you with his handcuffs in his pocket. You will look pretty in handcuffs, won't you, Betty? It's your white neck we want. 3 cheers for Waberski. The Scourge." Girardeau stared at the brutal words and settled his glasses on his nose and stared again. But he stammered, and he pointed to the date. A warning gesture made by Hanaud brought him to a sudden stop, but Frobisher had little doubt as to the purport of that unfinished exclamation. Girardeau was astonished, as Hanaud himself had been, that this item of news had so quickly leaked abroad. Hanaud folded the letter and turned back into the room. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said to Betty, and Thevenet the secretary took his notebook from his pocket. "Shall I make you a copy of the letter, Monsieur Hanaud?" he said, sitting down and holding out his hand. "I wasn't going to give it back," Hanaud answered, "and a copy at the present stage isn't necessary. A little later on I may ask for your assistance." He put the letter away in his letter case, and his letter case away in his breast pocket. When he looked up again he saw that Betty was holding out to him a key. "This unlocks the cabinet at the end of the room," she said. "Yes. Let us look now for the famous arrow, or we shall have Monsieur Frobisher displeased with us again," said Hanaud. The cabinet stood against the wall at the end of the room opposite to the windows, and close to the door which opened onto the hall. Hanaud took the key, unlocked the door of the cabinet and started back with a wow. He was really startled, for facing him upon a shelf were 2 tiny human heads, perfect in feature, in hair, in eyes, but reduced to the size of big oranges. They were the heads of Indian tribesmen killed upon the banks of the Amazon, and preserved and reduced by their conquerors by the process common amongst those forests. "If the arrow is anywhere in this room, it is here that we should find it," he said, but though he found many curious oddities in that cabinet, of the perfect specimen of a poison arrow there was never a trace. He turned away with an air of disappointment. "Well then, mademoiselle, there is nothing else for it," he said regretfully, and for an hour he searched that room, turning back the carpet, examining the upholstery of the chairs, and the curtains, shaking out every vase, and finally giving his attention to Betty's secretary. He probed every cranny of it, he discovered the simple mechanism of its secret drawers, he turned out every pigeonhole, working with extraordinary swiftness and replacing everything in its proper place. At the end of the hour the room was as orderly as when he had entered it, yet he had gone through it with a tooth comb. "No, it is not here," he said, and he seated himself in a chair and drew a breath. "But on the other hand, as the two ladies and Monsieur Frobisher are aware, I was prepared not to find it here." "We have finished, then?" said Betty, but Hanaud did not stir. For a moment, he replied, "I shall be glad, Monsieur Girardeau, if you will remove the seals in the hall from the door at the end of the room." The commissaire went out by the way of Mrs Harlowe's bedroom, accompanied by his secretary. After a minute had passed a key grated in the lock and the door was opened. The commissaire and his secretary returned into the room from the hall. "Good," said Hanaud. He rose from this chair and looking around at the little group, now grown puzzled and anxious, he said very gravely, "In the interest of justice I now ask that none of you shall interrupt me by either word or gesture. For I have an experiment to make." In a complete silence he walked to the fireplace and rang the bell. Chapter 14: An Experiment and a Discovery. Gaston answered the bell. "Will you please send Francine Rollard here?" said Hanaud. Gaston, however, stood his ground. He looked beyond Hanaud to Betty. "If mademoiselle gives me the order," he said respectfully. "At once then, Gaston," Betty replied, and she sat down in a chair. Francine Rollard was apparently difficult to persuade. For the minutes passed, and when at last she did come into the treasure room she was scared and reluctant. She was a girl hardly over 20, very neat and trim and pretty, and rather like some wild shy creature out of the woods. She looked round the group which awaited her with restless eyes and a sullen air of suspicion. But it was the suspicion of wild people for townsfolk. "Rollard," said Hanaud gently, "I sent for you, for I want another woman to help me in acting a little scene." He turned towards Ann Upcott. "Now, mademoiselle, will you please repeat exactly your movements here on the night when Madame Harlowe died? You came into the room, so. You stood by the electric light switch there. You turned it on, you noticed the time, and you turned it off quickly. For this communicating door stood wide open, so, and a strong light poured out of Madame Harlowe's bedroom through the doorway." Hanaud was very busy, placing himself first by the side of Anne to make sure that she stood in the exact place which she had described, and then running across the room to set wide open the communicating door. You could just see the light gleaming on the ornaments and panels of the sedan chair, on the other side of the fireplace on your right. So. And there, mademoiselle, you stood in the darkness, and his words lengthened out now with tiny intervals between each one. You heard the sound of the struggle in the bedroom and caught some words spoken in a clear whisper. "Yes," Anne replied with a shiver. The solemn manner of authority with which he spoke obviously alarmed her. She looked at him with troubled eyes. "Then will you stand there once more," he continued, "and once more listen as you listened on that night?" "I thank you." He went away to Betty. "Now, mademoiselle, and you, Francine Rollard, will you both please come with me?" He walked towards the communicating door, but Betty did not even attempt to rise from her chair. "Monsieur Hanaud," she said with her cheeks very white and her voice shaking, "I can guess what you propose to do. But it is horrible and rather cruel to us. And I cannot see how it will help." Ann Upcott broke in before Hanaud could reply. She was more troubled even than Betty, though without doubt hers was to be the easier part. "It cannot help at all," she said. "Why must we pretend now the dreadful thing which was lived then?" Hanaud turned about in the doorway. "Ladies, I beg you to let me have my way. I think that when I have finished, you will yourselves understand that my experiment has not been without its use. I understand, of course, that moments like these bring their distress. But you will pardon me, I am not thinking of you, and there was so much quietude and gravity in the detective's voice that his words, harsh though they were, carried with them no offense. No, I am thinking of a woman more than double the age of either of you, whose unhappy life came to an end here on the night of the 27th of April. I am remembering 2 photographs which you, Mademoiselle Harlowe, showed me this morning. I am moved by them. Yes, that is the truth. He closed his eyes as if he saw those 2 portraits with their dreadful contrast impressed upon his eyelids. I am her advocate, he cried aloud in a stirring voice. The tragic woman, I stand for her. If she was done to death, I mean to know and I mean to punish. Never had Frobisher believed that Hanaud could have been so transfigured, could have felt or spoken with so much passion. He stood before them an erect and menacing figure, all his grossness melted out of him, a man with a flaming sword. As for you 2 ladies, you are young. What does a little distress matter to you? A few shivers of discomfort? How long will they last? I beg you not to hinder me. Betty rose up from her chair without another word. But she did not rise without an effort, and when she stood up at last she swayed upon her feet and her face was as white as chalk. Come, Francine, she said, pronouncing her words like a person with an impediment of speech. We must show Monsieur Hanaud that we are not the cowards he takes us for. But Francine still held back. I don't understand at all. I am only a poor girl and this frightens me. The police. They set traps, the police. Hanaud laughed. And how often do they catch the innocent in them? Tell me that, Mademoiselle Francine. He turned almost contemptuously towards Mrs. Harlowe's bedroom. Betty and Francine followed upon his heels, the others trooped in behind, with Frobisher last of all. He indeed was as reluctant to witness Hanaud's experiment as the girls were to take a part in it. It savoured of the theatrical. There was to be some sort of imagined reproduction of the scene which Ann Upcott had described, no doubt with the object of testing her sincerity. It would really be a test of nerves more than a test of honesty, and to Jim was therefore neither reliable nor fair play. He paused in the doorway to say a word of encouragement to Anne, but she was gazing again with that curious air of perplexity at the clock upon the marquetry cabinet. There is nothing to fear, Anne, he said, and she withdrew her eyes from the clock. They were dancing now as she turned them upon Frobisher. I wondered whether I should ever hear you call me by my name, she said with a smile. Thank you, Jim. She hesitated and then the blood suddenly mounted into her face. I'll tell you I was a little jealous, she added in a low voice and with a little laugh at herself as though she was a trifle ashamed of the confession. Jim was luckily spared the awkwardness of an answer by the appearance of Hanaud in the doorway. I hate to interrupt, Monsieur Frobisher, he said with a smile, but it is of a real importance that Mademoiselle should listen without anything to distract her. Jim followed Hanaud into the bedroom, and was startled. The commissaire and his secretary and Monsieur Bex were in a group apart near to one of the windows. Betty Harlowe was stretched upon Mrs. Harlowe's bed, Francine Rollard stood against the wall, near to the door, clearly frightened out of her wits and glancing from side to side with the furtive restless eyes of the half-tamed. But it was not this curious spectacle which so surprised Jim Frobisher, but something strange, something which almost shocked, in the aspect of Betty herself. She was leaning upon an elbow with her eyes fixed upon the doorway and the queerest, most inscrutable fierce look in them that he had ever seen. She was quite lost to her environment. The experiment from which Francine shrank had no meaning for her. She was possessed, the old phrase leapt into Jim's thoughts, though her face was as still as a mask of frozen passion. It was only for a second, however, that the strange seizure lasted. Betty's face relaxed, she dropped back upon the bed with her eyes upon Hanaud like one waiting for instructions. Hanaud, by pointing a finger, directed Jim to take his place amongst the group at the window. He placed himself upon one side of the bed, and beckoned to Francine. Very slowly she approached the end of the bed. Hanaud directed her in the same silent way to come opposite to him on the other side of the bed. For a little while Francine refused, She stood stubbornly shaking her head at the very foot of the bed. She was terrified of some trick, and when at last at a sign from Betty she took up the position assigned to her, she minced to it gingerly as though she feared the floor would open beneath her feet. Hanaud made her another sign as she looked at a scrap of paper on which Hanaud had written some words. The paper and her orders had obviously been given to her whilst Jim was talking to Ann Upcott. Francine knew what she was to do, but her suspicious peasant nature utterly revelled against it. Hanaud beckoned to her with his eyes riveted upon her, compelling her, and against her will she bent forwards over the bed and across Betty Harlowe's body. A nod from Hanaud now, and she spoke in a low, clear whisper. "That will do, now." And hardly had she spoken those few words which Ann Upcott said she had heard on the night of Mrs Harlowe's death, but Hanaud himself must repeat them, and also in a whisper. Having whispered, he cried aloud towards the doorway in his natural voice. "Did you hear, mademoiselle? Was that the whisper which reached your ears on the night when Madame died?" All those in the bedroom waited for the answer in suspense. Francine Rollard, indeed, with her eyes fixed upon Hanaud in a very agony of doubt. And the answer came. "Yes, but whoever whispered twice this afternoon. On the night when I came down in the dark to the treasure room, the words were only whispered once." "It was the same voice which whispered them twice, mademoiselle?" "Yes, I think so. I noticed no difference, yes." And Hanaud flung out his arms with a comic gesture of despair, and addressed the room. "You understand now my little experiment. A voice that whispers. How shall one tell it from another voice that whispers? There is no intonation, no depth, no lightness. There is not even sex in a voice which whispers. We have no clue, no, not the slightest, to the identity of the person who whispered. That will do now, on the night when Madame Harlowe died." He waved his hand towards Monsieur Bex. "I will be glad you will open now these cupboards, and Mademoiselle Harlowe will tell us, to the best of her knowledge, whether anything has been taken or anything disturbed." Hanaud returned to the treasure room, leaving Monsieur Bex and Betty at their work, with the commissaire and his secretary to supervise them. Jim Frobisher followed him. He was very far from believing that Hanaud had truthfully explained the intention of his experiment. The impossibility of identifying a voice which whispers. Here was something with which Hanaud must have been familiar from 100 cases. No, that interpretation would certainly not work. There was quite another true reason for this melodramatic little scene which he had staged. He was following Hanaud in the hope of finding out that reason, when he heard him speaking in a low voice, and he stopped inside the dressing-room close to the communicating door where he could hear every word and yet not be seen himself. "Mademoiselle," Hanaud was saying to Ann Upcott, "there is something about this clock here which troubles you." "Yes, of course it's nonsense, I must be wrong, for here is the cabinet and on it stands the clock." Jim could gather from the two voices that they were both standing together close to the marquetry cabinet. "Yes, yes," Hanaud urged. "Still you are troubled." There was a moment's silence. Jim could imagine the girl looking from the clock to the door by which she had stood, and back again from the door to the clock. Surely that scene in the bedroom had been staged to extort some admission from Ann Upcott or the falsity of her story. Was he now, since the experiment had failed, resorting to another trick, setting a fresh trap? "Well?" he asked insistently. "Why are you troubled?" "It seems to me," Anne replied in a voice of doubt, "that the clock is lower now than it was. Of course it can't be, and I had only one swift glimpse of it, yet my recollection is so vivid, the room standing out revealed in the moment of bright light, and then vanishing into darkness again. Yes, the clock seemed to me to be placed higher." And suddenly she stopped as if a warning hand had been laid upon her arm. Would she resume? Jim was still wondering when silently, like a swift animal, Hanaud was in the doorway and confronting him. "Yes, Monsieur Frobisher," he said with an odd note of relief in his voice, "we shall have to enlist you in the Sûreté very soon." "That I can see. Come in." He took Jim by the arm and led him into the room. "As for that matter of the clock, mademoiselle, the light goes up and goes out. It would have been a marvel if you had within that flash of vision seen every detail precisely true. No, there is nothing there." He flung himself into a chair and sat for a little while silent in an attitude of dejection. "You said this morning to me, monsieur, that I had nothing to go upon, that I was guessing here, and guessing there, stirring up old troubles which had better be left quietly in their graves, and at the end discovering nothing. Upon my word, I believe you are right. My little experiment. Was there ever a failure more abject?" Hanaud sat up alertly. "What is the matter?" he asked. Jim Frobisher had had a brainwave. The utter disappointment upon Hanaud's face and in his attitude had enlightened him. Yes, his experiment had failed. For it was aimed at Francine Rollard. He had summoned her without warning, he had bidden her upon the instant to act a scene, nay, to take the chief part in it, in the hope that it would work upon her and break her down to a confession of guilt. He suspected Anne. Well, then, Anne must have had an accomplice. To discover the accomplice, there was the object of the experiment. And it had failed abjectly, as Hanaud himself confessed. Francine had shrunk from the ordeal, no doubt, but the reason of the shrinking was manifest: fear of the police, suspicion of a trap, the furtive helplessness of the ignorant. She had not delivered herself into Hanaud's toils. But not a word of this conjecture did Jim reveal to Hanaud. To his question what was the matter, he answered simply, "Nothing." Hanaud beat with the palms of his hands upon the arms of his chair. "Nothing, eh? Nothing. That's the only answer in this case. To every question. To every search. Nothing, nothing, nothing," and as he ended in a sinking voice, a startled cry rang out in the bedroom. "Betty!" Anne exclaimed. Hanaud threw off his dejection like an overcoat. Jim fancied that he was out of his chair and across the dressing room before the sound of the cry had ceased. Certainly Betty could not have moved. She was standing in front of the dressing table, looking down at a big jewel case of dark blue Morocco leather, and she was lifting up and down the open lid of it with an expression of utter incredulity. "Aha!" said Hanaud. "It is unlocked. We have something, after all, Monsieur Frobisher. Here is a jewel case unlocked, and jewel cases do not unlock themselves. It was here?" He looked towards the cupboard in the wall, of which the door stood open. "Yes," said Betty, "I opened the door, and took the case out by the side handles. The lid came open when I touched it. Will you look through it, please, and see whether anything is missing?" While Betty began to examine the contents of the jewel case, Hanaud went to Francine, who stood apart. He took her by the arm and led her to the door. "I am sorry if I frightened you, Francine," he said. "But, after all, we are not such alarming people, the police, eh? No, so long as good little maids hold their good little tongues, we can be very good friends. Of course, if there is chatter, little Francine, and gossip, little Francine, and that good-looking baker's boy is tomorrow spreading over Dijon the story of Hanaud's little experiment, Hanaud will know where to look for the chatterers." "Monsieur, I shall not say one word," cried Francine. "And how wise that will be, little Francine," Hanaud rejoined in a horribly smooth and silky voice. For Hanaud can be the wickedest of wicked uncles to naughty little chatterers. Oh, ho, ho, yes. He seizes them tight, so, and it will be ever so long before he says to them, "That will do now." He rounded off his threats with a quite friendly laugh and gently pushed Francine Rollard from the room. Then he returned to Betty, who had lifted the tray out of the box and was opening some smaller cases which had been lying at the bottom. The light danced upon pendant and bracelet, buckle and ring, but Betty still searched. "You miss something, mademoiselle?" "Yes." "It was, after all, certain that you would," Hanaud continued. "If murders are committed, there will be some reason. I will even venture to guess that the jewel which you miss is of great value." "It is," Betty admitted. "But I expect it has only been mislaid. No doubt we shall find it somewhere, tucked away in a drawer." She spoke with very great eagerness, and a note of supplication that the matter should rest there. "In any case, what has disappeared is mine, isn't it? And I am not going to imitate Monsieur Boris. I make no complaint." Hanaud shook his head. "You are very kind, mademoiselle. But we cannot, alas. Say here, that will do now. It was strange to Jim to notice how he kept harping upon the words of that whisper. We are not dealing with a case of theft, but with a case of murder. We must go on. What is it that you miss? A pearl necklace, Betty answered reluctantly. A big one. It was noticeable that as Betty's reluctance increased, Hanaud became more peremptory and abrupt. Not so very. Describe it to me, mademoiselle. Betty hesitated. She stood with a troubled face looking out upon the garden. Then with a shrug of resignation she obeyed. There were 35 pearls, not so very large, but they were perfectly matched and of a beautiful pink. My uncle took a great deal of trouble and some years to collect them. Madame told me herself that they actually cost him nearly £100,000. They would be worth even more now. A fortune, then, cried Hanaud. Not a person in that room had any belief that the necklace would be found, laid aside somewhere by chance. Here was Hanaud's case building itself up steadily. Another story was added to it this afternoon. This or that experiment might fail. What did that matter? A motive for the murder came to light now. Jim had an intuition that nothing now could prevent a definite result, that the truth, like a beam of light that travels for 1,000,000 of years, would in the end strike upon a dark spot, and that someone would stand helpless and dazzled in a glare, the criminal. Who knew of this necklace of yours, mademoiselle, beside yourself? Hanaud asked. Everyone in the house, monsieur. Madame wore it nearly always. She wore it, then, on the day of her death. Yes, Betty began, and she turned towards Anne for confirmation, and then swiftly turned away in. I think so. I am sure of it, said Anne steadily, though her face had grown rather white and her eyes anxious. How long has Francine Rollard been with you? Hanaud asked of Betty. 3 years. No, a little more. She is the only maid I have ever had, Betty answered with a laugh. I see, Hanaud said thoughtfully, and what he saw, it seemed to Jim Frobisher that everyone else in that room saw too. For no one looked at Ann Upcott. Old servants do not steal valuable necklaces. Ann Upcott and Jeanne Bourdin, the nurse, were the only newcomers to the Maison Grenelle these many years, and Jeanne Bourdin had the best of characters. Thus the argument seemed to run, though no one expressed it in words. Hanaud turned his attention to the lock of the cupboard, and shook his head over it. Then he crossed to the dressing table and the morocco case. Aha! He said with a lively interest. This is a different affair, and he bent down closely over it. The case was not locked with a key at all. There were 3 small gilt knobs in the front of the case, and the lock was set by the number of revolutions given to each knob. These, of course, could be varied with each knob, and all must be known before the case could be opened. Mrs Harlowe's jewels had been guarded by a formula. There has been no violence used here, said Hanaud, standing up again. Of course my aunt may have forgotten to lock the case, said Betty. Of course that's possible, Hanaud agreed. And of course this room was open to anyone between the time of my aunt's funeral and Sunday morning, when the doors were sealed. A week, in fact, with Boris Waberski in the house, said Hanaud. Yes, said Betty. But I expect it is just mislaid and we shall find it. You see, Monsieur Boris expected to get some money from my lawyers in London. No doubt he meant to make a bargain with me. It doesn't look as if he had stolen it. He wouldn't want £1,000 if he had. Jim had left Boris out of his speculations. He had recollected him with a thrill of hope that he would be discovered to be the thief when Hanaud mentioned his name. But the hope died away again before the reluctant and deadly reasoning of Betty Harlowe. On the other hand, if Boris and Anne were really accomplices in the murder, because he wanted his legacy, the necklace might well have been Anne's share. More and more, whichever way one looked at it, the facts pointed damningly towards Anne. Well, we will see if it has been mislaid, said Hanaud. But meanwhile, mademoiselle, it would be well for you to lock that case up and to take it sometime this afternoon to your bankers. Betty shut down the lid and spun the knobs one after the other. 3 times a swift succession of sharp little clicks was heard in the room. You have not used, I hope, the combination which Madame Harlowe used, said Hanaud. I never knew the combination she used, said Betty. She lifted the jewel case back into its cupboard, and the search of the drawers and the cupboards began. But it was as barren of result as had been the search of the treasure room for the arrow. We can do no more, said Hanaud. Yes. One thing more. The correction came quietly from Ann Upcott. She was standing by herself, very pale and defiant. She knew now that she was suspected. The very care with which everyone had avoided even looking at her had left her in no doubt. Hanaud looked about the room. What more can we do? He asked. You can search my rooms. No, cried Betty violently. I won't have it. If you please, said Anne. It is only fair to me. Monsieur Bex nodded violently. Mademoiselle could not be more correct, said he. Anne addressed herself to Hanaud. I shall not go with you. There is nothing locked in my room except a small leather dispatch case. You will find the key to that in the left-hand drawer of my dressing table. I will wait for you in the library. Hanaud bowed, and before he could move from his position Betty did a thing for which Jim could have hugged her there and then before them all. She went straight to Anne and set her arm about her waist. I'll wait with you, Anne, she said. Of course it's ridiculous, and she led Anne out of the room. Chapter 15 The Finding of the Arrow. Anne's rooms were upon the second floor with the windows upon the garden, a bedroom and a sitting room communicating directly with one another. They were low in the roof, but spacious, and Hanaud, as he looked around the bedroom, said in a tone of doubt, yes, after all, if one were frightened suddenly out of one's wits, one might stumble about this room in the dark and lose one's way to the light switch. There isn't one over the bed. Then he shrugged his shoulders. But, to be sure, one would be careful that one's details could be verified. So and the doubt passed out of his voice. The words were all Greek to the commissaire of police and his secretary and Monsieur Bex. Maurice Thevenet, indeed, looked sharply at Hanaud, as if he was on the point of asking one of those questions which he had been invited to ask. But Giardeau, the commissaire, who was panting heavily with his ascent of 2 flights of stairs, spoke first. We shall find nothing to interest us here, he said. That pretty girl would never have asked us to pry about amongst her dainty belongings if there had been anything to discover. One never knows, replied Hanaud. Let us see. Jim walked away into the sitting room. He had no wish to follow step by step Hanaud and the commissaire in their search, and he had noticed on the table in the middle of the room a blotting pad and some notepaper and the materials for writing. He wanted to get all this whirl of conjecture and fact and lies, in which during the last 2 days he had lived, sorted and separated and set in order in his mind, and he knew no better way of doing so than by putting it all down shortly in the for and against style of Robinson Crusoe on his desert island. He would have a quiet hour or so whilst Hanaud indefatigably searched. He took a sheet of paper, selected a pen at random from the tray and began. It cost Ann Upcott, however, a good many sheets of notepaper, and more than once the nib dropped out of his penholder and was forced back into it before he had finished. But he had his problem reduced at last to these terms. 4. 1. Although suspicion that murder had been committed arose in the first instance only from the return to its shelf of the treatise on Strophanthus hispidus, subsequent developments, e.g., the disappearance of the poison arrow, the introduction into the case of the ill-famed Jean Claddle, Ann Upcott's story of her visit to the treasure room, and now the mystery of Mrs Harlowe's pearl necklace, make out a prima facie case for inquiry. Against. But in the absence of any trace of poison in the dead woman's body, it is difficult to see how the criminal can be brought to justice, except by a confession, b. the commission of another crime of a similar kind. Hanaud's theory, once a poisoner always a poisoner. 4. 2. If murder was committed, it is probable that it was committed at 10:30 at night when Ann Upcott in the treasure room heard the sound of a struggle and the whisper, "That will do now." Against. Ann Upcott's story may be partly or wholly false. She knew that Mrs Harlowe's bedroom was to be opened and examined. If she also knew that the pearl necklace had disappeared, She must have realized that it would be advisable for her to tell some story before its disappearance was discovered, which would divert suspicion from her. 4. 3. It is clear that whoever committed the murder, if murder was committed, Betty Harlowe had nothing to do with it. She had an ample allowance. She was at M. de Poulac's ball on the night. Moreover, once Mrs. Harlowe was dead, the necklace became Betty Harlowe's property. Had she committed the murder, the necklace would not have disappeared. Against. It is possible that the disappearance of the necklace is in no way connected with the murder, if murder there was. 4. 4. Who then are possibly guilty? 1. The servants. Against. All of them have many years of service to their credit. It is not possible that any of them would have understood enough of the treatise on Strophanthus Hispidus to make use of it. If any of them were concerned, it can only be as an accessory or assistant working under the direction of another. 4. 2. Jeanne Bourdin, the nurse. More attention might be given to her. It is too easily accepted that she has nothing to do with it. Against. No one suspects her. Her record is good. 4. 3. Francine Rollard. She was certainly frightened this afternoon. The necklace would be a temptation. Was it she who bent over Ann Upcott in the darkness? Against. She was frightened of the police as a class, rather than of being accused of a crime. She acted her part in the reconstruction scene without breaking down. If she were concerned, it could only be for the reason given above, as an assistant. 4. 4. Ann Upcott. Her introduction into the Maison Grenelle took place through Waberski and under dubious circumstances. She is poor, a paid companion, and the necklace is worth a considerable fortune. She was in the house on the night of Mrs. Harlowe's death. She told Gaston he could turn out the lights and go to bed early that evening. She could easily have admitted Waberski and received the necklace as the price of her complicity. The story she told us in the garden may have been the true story of what occurred adapted. It may have been she who whispered that will do now. She may have whispered it to Waberski. Her connection with Waberski was sufficiently close to make him count upon Anne's support in his charge against Betty. Against. Her introductions may be explicable on favorable grounds. Until we know more of her history, it is impossible to judge. Her account of the night of the 27th April may be true from beginning to end. In that case, the theory of a murder is enormously strengthened. But who whispered, "That will do now"? And who was bending over Ann Upcott when she waked up? Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.